If you've ever walked into a coffee shop and been confused when a coffee is labeled as anaerobically fermented with wine yeast and dried on raised beds, then this video is for you. Hello, my name is Stephen Holm and I'm with HomeGrounds. We help you brew and enjoy better quality coffee at home. If you are new around here, welcome. If you'd like to subscribe and like this video, that would be helpful for us, but also helpful for you so you don't miss out on any of our future videos. So like I said, today we are talking about processing methods in coffee and specifically experimental processing methods. Now to begin this video, I just want to say that our friends at Trade Coffee helped us out by acquiring some of these coffees. They are not paying for this video in any way. I just reached out to them because I saw they had some offerings on their website that were experimentally processed coffees. They sent them to me for free to review, and I'll throw a link in the description down below, but all of that just to be fully transparent up front. Now to start off with, let's talk about what processing methods actually are. These are when you look at a bag of coffee, and sometimes they're just labeled processing method, but other times you might just see the term washed or natural. And if you're unfamiliar with these terms, we could do an entire video going over what processing methods actually are, but just a quick summary. So coffee beans are actually the seeds of a coffee cherry, and those cherries are grown on a shrub or bush or tree or whatever, and after those are picked, a farmer or a coffee mill needs to figure out how to remove the cherry, the skin, and then finally a mucilage layer that is on the beans themselves before that coffee is ready to be dried and sent out to roasteries. And how someone might determine how that coffee is going to be processed has historically been just due to either history, how a plant has been doing it for a long time, or based on the resources that they have at their disposal. And there have mainly been 2 or 3 main types of processing methods done in the past. The first and probably most common method is the washed processing method. What this means is that after a coffee cherry is picked, that skin and fruit is immediately removed from the bean. So they go through what's called a depulper, and that's basically just going to strip away all of the cherry fruit and skin off, so all you are left with is the bean with a mucilage layer around it. So in order to remove that mucilage layer, the beans are placed in water and allowed to ferment, and that will be able to strip off the mucilage layer, which then the beans can be set out to dry and then packaged to ship out. Now another main way to process coffee is what's called the natural processing method. And what this is once a coffee cherry is picked, it is then set out to dry, typically on raised beds, so you have nice circulation all around the cherries. And so those cherries are set out to dry and ferment. After a few days, the fruit is removed and the mucilage comes along with it, and then you have dried coffee beans, so no water is needed to use in the process. Now another common processing method you'll see is kind of a middle ground between those, and it's called the honey processing method. And what this is once a cherry is picked, the fruit is removed, but not all of the fruit. So it's similar to a wash process in that we're immediately removing some of the fruit, but then we're letting that ferment with some of the fruit still intact, so you're getting some of that fruit acidity and fermentation into the bean itself versus just a full natural where you're getting all of it, or a washed where you're not getting any of the fruit. So that is a very quick summary of processing methods, hopefully just enough that we can move on to what I'm gonna call experimental processing. And what I'm gonna mean by experimental today is just that we are deviating from the norms of processing methods by either a little bit, or maybe a mill has gone a long ways to experiment with completely new methods that are bringing us entirely different coffees than we are used to. So in order to do this, I'm gonna brew each of these coffees and talk about them individually, talk about the processing methods that were used and how that affects the flavor, so we can get a basic idea of what these methods are doing and how they're affecting the taste of our coffees. So to begin, let's just dive into our first coffee, and I'm gonna brew a cup and we're gonna talk about it. So to start off, we are going to be brewing a coffee from Brazil from Peixoto Coffee Roasters. I am probably mispronouncing that. I will have a few of those today, and I want to apologize in advance. And for all of these coffees today, I'm just going to be brewing a very basic V60 recipe. They may not be the best brews possible out of each coffee, but at least they'll be consistent. Now, while this is finishing up, I'll quickly talk about the processing method that is used for this coffee. So Peixoto is a really cool coffee company in that they have a family farm that they've had for years in Brazil, and now they have a roastery based out of Arizona. This coffee in particular, this is the Brazil Aurora Vermelha, and this is a coffee that uses a traditional natural processing method. But they've really perfected the process over the 100+ years that they've been doing it, and have found certain variables that help impact the cup in ways that they prefer. So the coffee cherries are picked and placed in a large pile exposed to oxygen and allowed to ferment. And they allow the cherries to sit out at a lower temperature than usual and for a longer amount of time. Peixoto found that it really helped emphasize acidity, body, and fruit characteristics in the coffee. So now that it's done brewing, let's give it a taste. I don't typically love doing live tastings on this channel just because they're extremely subjective, and what this tastes like to me may taste completely different to you, but hopefully these will all just give you an idea of what these experimental processing methods are doing. So right away, this coffee is a lot better than most naturally processed Brazils I've had. Typically, I would expect something with a little less clarity in the cup, so a lot of flavors that you can't really make out what each one individually is. And I would expect something a little more fermented tasting, something I would usually call boozy, so you're getting a little bit of an alcohol-y taste in there. But this coffee, on the other hand, is very clean. It feels well structured as far as flavors go, so I can get fruit characteristics out of it. It has some nice sweetness in there, like caramels, a little bit of chocolate, and it's got a really nice heavy body, has some lingering acidity. Overall, it's a very good cup of coffee. So I think this coffee is a really good example of a processing method that has been around for a really long time, but we're really starting to understand the science behind what is going on in this method, and processing mills are able to take that and, in this case, say, do a lower temperature overall for an extended amount of time. So I would consider that an experimental method. They are deviating slightly from what they would typically do, and I think that they are getting really great results. This is a delicious cup of coffee. Now, next up, we are taking a look at a really pretty little box set here that actually has 2 coffees in it from 2 different roasters, but they collaborated. So we have 2 coffees in here. They're from Colombia. They're using a really cool variety called Chirroso, which is new to me. I'm really excited to try it. We won't be diving into that today. The coffees are from Methodical Roasters and Portrait Coffee. So let's brew them and talk about what they are doing. They also come with these really nice cards that have good descriptions about the coffees, so well done. So first up is this one from Portrait Coffee. It is from Alvaro Ramirez. This coffee smells crazy. Now this coffee is really interesting in that it is technically a wash process, but the cherries are actually allowed to ferment in batches before going through the depulping and washing process. They said to look at the process like a 5-day week. So on Monday, pickers pick the coffee when they're at their most ripe, bring them back, and they set them out to ferment. The next day, they go out, pick more cherries, and they add them to that same pile to ferment. Wednesday, they do the same thing. So now they have 3 days worth of coffee picked at different days, all fermenting together. And now all of those cherries together are allowed to ferment for another 48 hours until Friday, which they are then removed and depulped and gone through the washing process. And what they found is that this process not only allows some of the fermentation aspects of naturally processed coffee, but also the batch fermentation allows for a lot more complexity than just any standard wash coffee. So I'm really excited to try it. We are done brewing. Let's give it a taste. So right away, this coffee is very interesting. It has a very high acidity, a lot of lighter fruit flavors, almost like a lemon lime characteristic. It has a nice body, not super heavy. It does have a nice lingering finish. Let's brew the other cup and we can compare them because the coffees themselves are very similar, like I said, but the processing methods are different. So let's brew this one from Methodical from Santiago Caro. So the processing method for this coffee is actually kind of similar to the first one we did. However, instead of doing that batch style fermentation, all the cherries that are picked are left out to ferment with each other. We're not adding batches on top of that. And those cherries are allowed to ferment for 5 days in stainless steel tanks. So they found that using stainless steel tanks allowed for a lot more consistency. And then after those 5 days, the beans are depulped, washed, and then they're allowed out to dry for, they said, 3 to 4 weeks in order to bring the coffee to the proper moisture content before being bagged up and shipped out. So a lot of variables are being controlled with this coffee, which is really important. So they're getting a lot of consistency and hopefully consistently good results out of the coffee. So the first one from Portrait, from Methodical. Yeah, so the coffees themselves have very similar characteristics, and I wonder if that's that chorizo, not chorizo, chorizo variety, but they both have a very wine-like characteristic. I would say that the one from Methodical is less complex than the one from Portrait, which kind of makes sense because the one from Portrait is the coffee that was fermented in batches. So theoretically, we probably have varying levels of fermentation going on at once. And so in the cup, my guess would be that that would lead to more complexity and varying levels. They're both very sweet, have a nice body, nice acidity, well-rounded. Overall, very, very good cups of coffee. Like, I'm very happy with both of these coffees. Now, next up is a coffee from Red Rooster Coffee out of Floyd, Virginia. And I'm really excited about this one because it is an anaerobic natural process from Ethiopia. I will talk about that later, but for now, let's brew it. So on top of the interesting processing method that we'll talk about in a minute, this is our first naturally processed coffee. So already we're going to get a lot more fruit characteristics, a lot more fermentation-y aspects in the coffee. Typically, naturally processed coffees can be a little divisive in the coffee community because some people really love them and really enjoy them. Some people absolutely hate them, and that's okay. So like I said earlier, this coffee is using an anaerobic fermentation process. What that means and how the process works is the coffee cherries are picked. They are then put in plastic bags and sealed. And once the fermentation starts to occur after 16 hours, the oxygen is then removed from that sealed environment, and we have an anaerobic fermentation, which means without oxygen. So up until now, we've been looking at aerobic fermentation processes, which are open to the open air and allow all the naturally occurring bacteria and yeast to be a part of that process. But now we're removing that oxygen and having different things happen. And the beans are allowed to ferment, they say, from between 3 to 7 days, however long it takes to reach the optimal pH level and color. And then after that, they go through the typical drying process. They're thrown on some raised beds and go on from there. Cheers. Pretty good. This tastes like a pretty typical naturally processed Ethiopian. Heavy fruit flavors. We got blueberry, some strawberry, very berry forward, obviously. A fairly bright acidity and a very nice lingering sweet finish. However, if I had to say something's a little bit different, I would say maybe it's a little bit cleaner. Those flavors are a little bit easier to recognize and they're a little more pronounced, and it doesn't have as much of that fermented flavor as I would typically expect. Really good. So, I don't think I have much else to say about this coffee, so let's move on to our last one. Now, the last coffee I'll be talking about is from Luminous Coffee. If you've watched this channel in the past, you've probably seen me mention them a few times. They are not promoting this video in any way. I'm a subscriber to them. I'm a big fan of them because how could you not love this packaging? But anyways, this coffee is what they call a natural ice processing method. I'll get brewing and then we can talk about it. Oh, I forgot about my fortune cookies. So like I said, this coffee is from Colombia. It is from CoffeeNet, CoFinet, which is a producer that Luminous works with frequently. They are big into experimental processing. A few years back, they really started experimenting with temperatures during the fermentation stage, and they kept lowering it and lowering it until they decided, let's just freeze it. And so they began experimenting with freezing coffee during the fermentation stage. And I'm gonna read directly from Luminous's website because it makes a lot more sense than what I could say. This lot was exposed to a dry anaerobic fermentation for 24 hours. So anaerobic, once again, without oxygen, so it's in a sealed environment. And then later placed inside Grain Pro bags for 60 hours, maintaining the temperature below 22 degrees Celsius by placing the coffee inside of a water tank. Afterward, the coffee was frozen for 72 hours. Later, the coffee was placed on raised beds below 35 degrees Celsius until ideal moisture content was achieved. So this coffee, I would say, has gone through the most amount of experimentation as far as that processing method. They went through a lot of trial and error to decide on those times and those temperatures, and I think that it's going to play into the taste in the cup. So let's give it a taste. It smells wild. A final cheers. Ooh. So this coffee, no joke, just tastes like chocolate covered fruit candy. Heavy chocolate notes that are really sweet and really pleasing. There's also really, really bright fruit flavors. They say watermelon and papaya, I think, are on their tasting notes, and I very much agree. And they're hitting on this sweetness that is just, it tastes like hard candy. And I think that's sort of a good transition into how I wanted to end this video. I think if a lot of people tried a cup of something like this, they would completely change their mind about their perceptions of coffee if they're not a coffee drinker, or if they are someone who can only have cream or sugar with their coffee. Drinking this, it tastes like it has sugar in it. And so I think that experimental processing is really important in that aspect because it's bringing out entirely new flavors and introducing people to a whole new different experience. I have my own opinions, but I really want to hear yours. So please leave them in the comments down below. Let's start a conversation. If you want me to do more videos like this, trying more out there experimental processing methods, definitely let me know. I would love to get some more coffees and taste them on the channel if that's something that interests you. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy brewing.